Right after King Henry VIII saw a painting of a woman named Anne of Cleves, he decided to marry her. The painting made her look beautiful and mysterious, so Henry thought she was perfect. But when they finally met in person, Henry was shocked. Her father, John, Duke of Cleves, didn't like the Pope or Catholic kings, and he made that very clear. Her mother didn't want Anne to marry Henry, and even tried to stop it from happening. He raised Anne, her sisters, and her brother to think for themselves and have their own opinions. This was important because Henry VIII also hated the Pope after he divorced his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. So when Anne became old enough to marry, Henry became interested in her. Anne was the older daughter, which meant she had more power and rights than Amalia. That probably mattered more to Henry than how she looked. But that doesn't seem true, because Henry had told him not to do that. Still, a painting can't show how two people will get along in real life, and let's just say, when Anne walked into the room for the first time, Henry was not happy. He thought she looked very ugly, even though that's just what he said. And he blamed not only the painter but also his advisor, Thomas Cromwell, who had encouraged him to marry Anne and kept saying she was beautiful. People today think there may have been a deeper, more troubling reason for why he acted so disgusted. Anne of Cleves came from a serious and strict family. Since he couldn't choose between Anne and Amalia, he told the painter to go make paintings of both of them so he could pick the one he liked best. He even gave Hans a special order. Paint the girls just as they are. Don't make them look better than they really do. Henry wanted to make sure he ended up with a beautiful queen, but things didn't go the way Henry hoped. Anne was very close to her mother, and she grew up in a house filled with strong women. Both Anne and Amalia were shy and wore veils to cover their faces, which was normal in Germany at the time. Hans had to be very kind and patient before the sisters finally showed their faces and let him paint them. Now, most people know that Henry VIII had a big problem with chasing after women, but not everyone knows how bad it really was, especially for Anne of Cleves. Anne was 24, which was considered mature for a royal bride, but Henry was much older, nearly twice her age, and he didn't just look at Anne as a possible wife. He also thought about marrying her younger sister, Amalia. That's right, he couldn't even decide which sister he wanted. In the late 1530s, Henry sent his royal painter, Hans Holbein, on a strange and awkward mission. But when Hans arrived, he had a big problem. When Hans brought the paintings back, Henry looked at them and chose Anne. But people think this decision wasn't really about beauty. Some stories say Hans made Anne look prettier in the painting than she really was. Almost right away, he complained that she wasn't as pretty as he had heard. Even though Henry didn't like how Anne looked when he met her, it was too late to cancel the wedding. Everything was already planned. He grumbled, saying, "She's not as pretty as people said." But the royal wedding had to go on. This was Anne's big chance to make Henry like her, but things didn't go well at all. Ouch. And it wasn't just that Anne didn't impress him in bed. Henry usually liked his wives to be quiet, sweet, and easy to control. But this time he said something even more hurtful. He claimed that Anne smelled bad. He said he noticed her bad smells at the worst moments. After they got married, there was something even worse coming, the wedding night. The next morning, Henry told people, "I didn't like her before very much, but now I like her even less." So he came up with a sneaky plan. A long time ago, when Anne was only 11 years old, she had been promised to a boy named Francis of Lorraine. He had his eyes on a young girl named Catherine Howard, and he married her just weeks after leaving Anne. She even gave Henry and his new wife a New Year's gift, 2 beautiful horses, and joined them for dancing at a party. They never got married, but Henry and his advisors tried to use this old promise to say the marriage to him was not valid. After that terrible wedding night, Henry wanted out of the marriage. In November 1541, people began whispering that Anne had secretly given birth to a child. They even held a full court trial to decide if the marriage should be cancelled. The whole thing was like a big messy circus. The marriage was officially cancelled on July 9, 1540, just 6 months after it began. It was the shortest of all his marriages. Anne was probably happy it was over. At least she kept her head, which was more than some of his other wives could say. Henry wanted to say that the marriage didn't count, because he and Anne had never actually done it. But at the same time, he didn't want people thinking he was the problem. So, To make himself look better, he brought in a doctor. This doctor said Henry did have night dreams, wet dreams, which meant he was still healthy and could be with women. But the doctor also said Henry had shared a bed with Anne for several nights and still didn't do anything with her. Too much information? Definitely. In the end, Henry got what he wanted. Again. But this wasn't the end of Anne and Henry's story. Even before the marriage was officially cancelled, Henry had already started looking for his next wife. Anne, being smart, acted like she was totally fine with it. She didn't complain. But just because Anne was no longer Henry's wife didn't mean her life would be easy. Soon, a dark and strange rumor started spreading around the palace. People in the palace started saying that Anne of Cleves had secretly had a baby. To make it even crazier, some people said the baby was actually King Henry VIII's son. But most historians today believe that was just a silly rumor and not true at all. That year, Henry believed his current wife, Catherine Howard, had cheated on him. She was very young and had made some big mistakes. Now she was locked up and waiting to be executed, just like Anne Boleyn had been before her. Still, the royal family took it seriously. Henry didn't ignore the gossip. He actually launched an investigation. He even had 2 people arrested for saying that Anne was the king's real wife and that they had slept together. By 1542, Anne was in trouble again, thanks to Henry, of course. But instead of handling the situation quietly, Henry decided to take out his anger on Anne of Cleves, too. After all, she had been kind, loyal, and friendly for years. She gave gifts to Prince Edward, who would one day become King Edward VI. She was close to Princess Mary, who later became Queen Mary the War. She stayed in the king's favor even after he died, thanks to her strong friendship with his children. And even Princess Elizabeth, who would become the famous Queen Elizabeth I, liked her. In fact, Anne left Elizabeth some of her jewelry when she died. Maybe now he would see she could be a better wife than the others. Anne had been smart. She stayed on good terms with Henry, always acting polite and friendly to avoid trouble. But that didn't stop Henry from being cruel. Secretly, she might have thought this was her chance to become queen again. He sent Anne a cold letter telling her to return a royal ring, a gift Catherine Howard had given her. That was Henry's way of showing he was in charge. When Henry finally had Catherine executed in 1542 for cheating, Anne may have had mixed feelings. There are signs that Anne hoped Henry would take her back and remarry her, but no, Henry had other plans. He went and married someone else, Catherine Parr, who became his 6th wife. Her strict family thought those things were silly, so she never learned them. That made it hard to connect with Henry, who loved the arts. Even if they spoke the same language, they had nothing fun to talk about. Even though Anne didn't become queen again, she still stayed close to the royal family. She was very smart and had a good education for a princess. She even learned English very fast after coming to England, which made it easier to speak with Henry and others. But Anne had one big problem. She didn't know much about things like music, singing, or dancing. Still, Anne was clever. She became friends with all of Henry's children. Anne knew how to stay close to power, and it helped her. Later in life, Anne lived a calm, happy life away from the noisy royal court. When Queen Mary became queen, Anne was likely at her coronation at Westminster Abbey. That's how close they were. Even though Anne had once been rejected as a wife, she managed to live a safe, respected life, something not many of Henry's wives could say. After Anne and Henry got divorced, Anne's life actually turned out pretty good, especially compared to the other wives. Henry gave her a great deal. She got beautiful houses, land, and a royal allowance of money. That meant she kept her freedom and had more money than most women in England. He also gave her an important new title. He said Anne would be the highest-ranking lady in England, except for his wife and daughters, and he even started calling her his beloved sister. That was his way of showing respect, even though he didn't want to stay married to her. But Henry didn't stop there. But here is something people still wonder. Was Anne really as ugly as Henry said? If he really wanted to cancel it, he could have, right? And probably looked nice, but some said she had a serious face, which made her seem older than she really was. At the time she met Henry, she was only 24 years old. Since she had stayed so close to Queen Mary, it was Queen Mary's helpers who buried her in Westminster Abbey, one of the most famous places in all of England. Her grave wasn't in a fancy spot. but she still had a powerful message written on it. Of course, all the gifts and titles couldn't erase the pain Anne had gone through. Remember Thomas Cromwell, the man who helped set up their marriage? Well, Henry was so unhappy with Anne that he blamed Cromwell for the whole thing. While she was there, she looked out the window and watched something called bull baiting, a cruel sport back then. Cromwell was arrested and executed for treason on the same day Henry married his next wife, Catherine Howard. He was wearing plain clothes and pretending to be someone else because he wanted to surprise Anne. He hoped that if she truly loved him, she would be able to recognize him, even without his royal outfit. Kind of like a true love test. But she politely ignored him because she thought he was just some random man. In the other version, he actually tried to hug or kiss her without asking, and Anne got scared and called for help. Most likely no. Historians today think she looked just fine. She was tall, had light blonde hair. Anne survived being Henry's fourth wife, but not everyone involved was so lucky. Now here's a big question. If Henry didn't like Anne so much, why didn't he stop the wedding before it happened? Maybe it was that she didn't react the way Henry wanted her to. From that moment on, he may have decided that she wasn't good enough for him. After all, he was the King of England. Some people believe that this very moment ruined everything. Anne didn't know the strange man was the king, so she didn't act excited or loving, and because of that, Henry may have made up his mind to dislike her no matter what. Marrying Anne meant that England would become closer friends with her powerful German family. If Henry had broken off the wedding, it would have insulted them and caused serious problems. Well, it wasn't that simple. Anne and Henry's marriage was not just about love. It was a political deal. So even though he wasn't happy, Henry went ahead with the marriage. She died on July 16, 1557, just a few months before her 42nd birthday. She had been living in England, the country she had come to as a young woman, and she most likely died from cancer. In the end, Anne didn't just outlive all of Henry's other wives, she also outlived Henry himself. When she passed away, her royal family gave her a respectful goodbye. Even though her marriage had been annulled, her tombstone still says, Anne of Cleves, Queen of England. And here is something truly special. She is the only one of Henry's 6 wives to be buried in Westminster Abbey. Even though Anne and Henry's marriage ended badly, some people think it all went wrong right from their first meeting, and not because of how Anne looked. When Anne was on her way to London for her wedding, she stopped at a place called Rochester on New Year's Day in 1540. Suddenly, a strange man walked into the room. But he wasn't just any stranger. It was King Henry VIII in disguise. But things didn't go as Henry hoped. There are 2 different stories about what happened next. In one version, Henry tried to get Anne's attention. No matter which story is true, the meeting ended badly. Henry left feeling angry, embarrassed, and maybe even ready to get revenge. So maybe the problem wasn't that Anne was ugly. And the rest, as they say, is history.